I would say, the market is shifting in three primary ways. Expectations are changing. Predictability is now sort of a paid for feature. I think with interest rates sort of doing what they're doing, with supply chain challenges, with challenges around talent are more impactful than they've ever been. And as a result, clients will pay a premium for that predictability. They'll buy guaranteed timelines, volatility to a certain extent as a result of these expectations shifting. I think is sort of the new villain, if you will. And then second to that is complexity, and complexity in so many ways. Our teams are changing. Think of the fact that we're now faced with managing humans and digital workers and AI agents sort of simultaneously. That's a new thing for all businesses these days. Not to mention the human teams are more distributed. They're more complex. There's more specialization across those teams. So that complexity is being added to projects and certainly creating a shift in the market as well. And then, the economics, you can't ignore that in today's climate, in today's world, certainly. Razor thin margins are sort of killing the concept that I think ruled project-based industries in the past, this concept of a heroic scramble where you could throw 10 extra people at a project in the last couple of weeks to make sure it got done. But the world we're living in today, with as margins as sensitive as they are, those types of things just aren't possible, just aren't viable anymore. So the economics of project delivery and the project economy is changing. And as a result, businesses need to respond in different ways. It's kind of like, it used to be sort of the art of delivery. You had really good project managers who just knew how to deliver projects. And part of what's shifting in the market is delivery is becoming more of a instrumented system that businesses need to develop. And I think that's a new thing for a lot of organizations. And I think those organizations that get sort of that delivery as an instrument right will definitely bode much better in their business and their growth and their performance. Those that maybe get that wrong and don't recognize that shift. Data is the new oil to a certain extent, but here I think there's a little bit of a paradox there. These organizations are oftentimes data rich, but I would also classify them as sort of signal poor. And it's not like these firms that work in these industries are tech illiterate. They've got CRM systems, they've got ERP solutions, they've got PSA solutions, project management solutions. But I think to a certain extent, they're drowning a little bit in sort of this dashboard overload situation. Everyone has a dashboard, but not necessarily everyone has the truth. And the Monday morning meeting becomes sort of an interesting conversation because, the business development person may say, hey, we've got $10 million in pipeline. Whereas the project management or operations person might say, whoa, we're already 90% capacity. And then the financial person might say, we're at 90% capacity, but we're 20% down in billing. So how all those things can be true simultaneously, I think is part of that data paradox. Because again, we have a lot of data, but we're signal poor to a certain extent. So the goal isn't 40 metrics nobody trusts. Instead, it's a focus on, or it should be a focus on, 8 to 10 key signals that leaders in the organization understand, agree on, and that everyone can act on. And I think there's sort of a cultural shift in the industries that's needed to shift more to signals and how that can drive action within businesses versus just having so much data that it really doesn't become useful for anybody. So there's a lot of signals, and certainly this is nuanced from one organization to the next, and even, to a certain extent, one project to the next. But if I were to distill it down to 3 or 4, first one I would say is decision latency and issue aging, if you will. A lot of times what actually slows projects down isn't necessarily the execution of the work. Sometimes that can be the case. Oftentimes, it's also things like waiting for approvals. It's waiting for feedback. If you expect and plan for a 2-day turnaround on a customer decision or something like that, and that consistently goes to 10 days, you're already in a bad situation in terms of being able to deliver that project on time. So I think a key signal is that decision latency, because if an issue is a week old, it's an issue. But if it becomes 10 weeks old, then it becomes a far more significant thing for the project. And being able to understand that early and being able to see that decision latency as a signal, I think is important. So that would be signal number 1. I think signal number 2 is unbilled or scope and commercial side of things, oftentimes people look at unbilled time as a finance problem. And I think it needs to be seen a little bit differently than that, because oftentimes it signals disputes, it signals unapproved work, it signals a client refusing to sign off on something for some other reason that they're unhappy. If the money stops flowing, it means that maybe trust has stopped flowing as well. I think it's safe to assume often that commercial friction almost always precedes a schedule slip and things like that. So, understanding sort of the unbilled situation, in this case, money flow is oftentimes a proxy for project health. And then I'm sure this will come as no surprise in the project-based world, but resourcing, I think, is a key signal as well. But this isn't just about utilization and capacity. I also think a key signal, especially in today's world, is resource churn and context switching. And this isn't just about people leaving because they're tired out or they're going to a different organization or something like that. You swap the lead engineer or the lead architect or lead analysis on a very complex project often, and that destroys context. And when that swap happens, that lead engineer or lead architect, whatever the case may be, often spends a lot more time sort of catching up and reorienting themselves with that project than they do on actually getting work done. So, taking a sports analogy, you can't sub out your quarterback for a different quarterback every quarter and expect to win the game. That's just not a good plan. So I think context switching and churn around resourcing is a key signal as well. And then the last one I would probably highlight is maybe drift or estimate at completion, EAC drift. I think a great analogy here is, we all use GPS to get lots of places in our cars. And, when you first start a journey and you're 10 minutes away from getting someplace, and then something happens, and now, it goes to 12 minutes, goes to 15 minutes, and you hear that recalculating. That's sort of where estimated completion drift comes into play. And you need to keep an eye on that to make sure that things aren't creeping to a point where you're going to have a big problem at the end of the project.